Well, welcome back for another guide video being filmed on my deck in the neighborhood where I live. And I hope you had a wonderful weekend. The weather was fantastic. After spending a good day out in the sun, I thought it would be fun to come to you outdoors while the weather is still nice and we still have some daylight left. I want to talk to you about what aspects melded together to create this phenomenon that we now refer to as rock and roll. Because there had to be a number of circumstances and also advancements in technology that occurred around the same time that resulted in the explosion in the popularity of this music that we now call rock and roll. Well, to understand the setup, coming out of World War II and the Depression, so late 1940s into the early 1950s and through the 1950s, we had a generation of parents who, as they grew up, they had to sacrifice, they had to do without. And coming out of World War II, our country experienced great economic prosperity. In fact, there were a number of people that were from this area of Appalachia who moved further north because of all of the great manufacturing jobs that they could secure. And you may have family who trekked on up north to work in some of the facilities up in Michigan, and maybe you still have relatives that live up there. Well, this economic prosperity of those parents translated into this. They wanted to make sure that their kids did not have to do without like they had to during the Depression and throughout World War II. So they, as they gained some economic success, passed that on to their children. And those teenagers of the early 1950s ended up having some of their own disposable income that they could use in whatever manner they wished. They could spend it on rock and roll records. Now, leading up to the creation of this music, you need to understand that in the early 1950s, we had these individual categories of music, genres of music, and thus individual charts. And those charts included, in terms of the significant and big charts, included the pop charts, the country and western charts, and the rhythm and blues charts. Now, when rock and roll became popular, some of what happened that set that up was the advent of crossover hits. That's one of those terms that we learned in the last video. A crossover is when you have a record that appears on one chart and it has success. And then another segment of the listening audience, a part of the listening audience that might like pop music, suddenly they like this record that first appeared on the country and western charts. And the audience that normally buys pop music would go out and buy the country and western record, and you would have that crossover. We talked about that being a phenomenon experienced by, Taylor Swift of recent years. Well, that happened back then too. So we had crossover hits, and a big hit that was a crossover was the song Earth Angel that had been recorded by the Penguins. It had originated on the rhythm and blues charts and then crossed over to the pop charts. Now, we also had covers going on where there were records that were recorded and were hits on a specific chart, and then another artist or band decided to record that same song and it became a hit on some other chart. And we had a number of covers that became very successful. Big Joe Turner was the originator of the hit Shake, Rattle, and Roll. And later, Bill Haley and the Comets covered that song and they turned it into their own hit. So covers and crossovers helped lead into this thing that created rock and roll. Now, something else that you need to know is what happened with technological advancements during this time. The technological advancements also played a huge role into why we ended up having this thing called rock and roll. Now, let me show you something. Here is the common size of a radio set from the 40s into maybe very early 1950s. That thing is huge. Do you see that? That thing is as big as that chair. It's a little bit bigger. Not anything that's very easy to carry around. Well, when we had the major entertainment coming from a radio set like that, the family would gather in the living room and they would listen to the same music and they would listen to the same shows. So on radio, we had shows like The Lone Ranger, Little Orphan Annie, very popular radio programs, including comedy shows like The Jack Benny Show. And we also had popular musics, of course, that were on the radio stations that the parents and the family would tune into. Thus, the kids listened to the music of their moms and dads. And Keith Richards talked about that in that first rock and roll documentary that you watched, listening to his mom's music. And that's where that influence of jazz came into his playing of the blues. And no small wonder, because no little kid could lift up a radio set that big and that heavy and carry it off to their room and listen to whatever music they wanted to listen to. Well, guess what? By the 1950s, we had great advancement in technological development of radios. We went from big sets like that to smaller transistor radios, radios that, well, were like this size and smaller, very easy to carry around. And kids, teenagers, they ended up getting these radios as maybe Christmas gifts, or perhaps they took some of that money that their parents gave them and went out and bought their own radio. So they could listen to the music they wanted to hear on their own radio when they wanted to hear the music. And that became very important, and that's what led to this, separation between what the parents listened to and what their teenagers were listening to. We also had that inclusion of radio in most models of cars that were sold in the 1950s. So as teenagers got their driver's licenses, they were able to drive around in cars and listen to the music they wanted to hear on their car radios. But that's not the only advancement in technology that led to this perfect breeding ground for the development of rock and roll. We also had this thing that came along and during the 1950s became very popular, and that is television. Television was invented, and it became so popular as families became economically more prosperous because of all those jobs that were out there. They wanted to keep up with their neighbors, and if their neighbor bought a radio set like this, well, they were going to save up their money and go buy one too. And that family entertainment switched from circling around a radio set like this to a television set. Well, how does that relate to the creation of rock and roll? Well, we had those programs like The Lone Ranger, like the Jack Benny Show, move from radio to television. So in the evening, when people were watching these shows now on television and not listening to them on radio, it opened up blocks of time and radio programming for, well, something else to be put on the air. And there were DJs around the country who enjoyed the music of rhythm and blues. And this guy here, Alan Freed, was the leader of the pack. Out of Cleveland, Alan Freed asked his radio station, well, hey, you're not playing that show this evening. Why don't you let me just get on the air and play some rhythm and blues records? Because he was a huge fan of rhythm and blues music. So at night, Alan Freed played his rhythm and blues. And guess what? Not every teenager was watching TV at night. Some of them were listening to their transistor radios, and they were tuning in to the Alan Freed Show. And they were also tuning in to other DJs around the country who were playing rhythm and blues. And they started to like and love what they were hearing. Now, how did these teenagers, get those radio programs onto their transistor radios? I mean, not everybody lived near Cleveland at that time, right? Well, music was played on radio primarily on the AM band. And if you have a radio in your car that has both the FM band and the AM band, or maybe you need to get a little radio set out like this, Something you need to know with AM radio, the radio waves, they bounce differently across the atmosphere. And on the AM band, radio stations, they actually have to adjust their power because of the way those radio waves hit part of our atmosphere. And when they adjust that power at night, this wild phenomenon happens, and it still happens. You can get a station that's way far away from you on your AM dial at night that you wouldn't hear during the daytime, just because of that adjustment that they make in the evening hours. Just to give you an example, this is something I still like to do because I used to work in broadcasting. I'll get in my car, and when I'm driving at night, occasionally I'll hit the AM band on my stereo in my car, and I'll just hit search to see what stations come in to, well, my speakers. And not too many years ago, I was driving pretty late at night. It was probably like 10 o'clock or so. And I was getting a station out of St. Louis, Missouri. And I was glued to the station because it was a music station. And the radio host was actually interviewing the original lead vocalist of the Moody Blues, Denny Laine. And Denny Laine spent many years working with Paul McCartney in Paul McCartney and Wings. I was listening to that here in Eastern Kentucky from all the way over in St. Louis, Missouri. It was amazing, amazing. And I challenge you, get out a radio, whether it's your car radio or a small radio set. Turn on the AM band, and late at night, see what stations you can get. I betcha you're going to be able to get some stations at least out of Cincinnati and maybe upwards of northern Ohio, and you'll be able to hear them crystal clear. It's really kind of a cool phenomenon. So that's why people like Alan Freed and some of those other DJs, including like Dewey Phillips out of Tennessee, teenagers, when they were listening to their AM band transistor radios, they could hear those shows from great distances away. And Alan Freed's show was so popular in 1954, he got contracted by ABC to move his show to New York City so that they could syndicate it all the way across the nation. So that meant that people heard Alan Freed not only in New York, but as that signal was passed along to the sister stations all across the nation, suddenly all of these teenagers around the country knew this guy and listened to the rock and roll that he played. Now, of course, in that first documentary, they talked a little bit about Alan Freed, and you're going to learn more in our upcoming documentary that I'm going to link you to. And what we just talked about tonight is to prepare you for that next episode in the series, The History of Rock and Roll. We're going to watch episode 2, Good Rockin' Tonight. And I want you to know, I tried to find access to a video that gave us the best resolution. It's still not perfect, but the audio is very clear. And I'm going to provide for you a list of all the different artists and songwriters and producers as they appear in order, because sometimes their names are cut off in this particular upload of that episode. But I'd like for you to watch it, but I do need to give you a warning. This particular episode does contain historical newsreels. Rock and roll became very controversial when it became popular because, again, the teenagers were listening to music that their parents didn't listen to. And that didn't mean that the parents were very pleased about it. These hit records that first crossed over onto the pop charts and became part of our early rock and roll were primarily rhythm and blues records. And this music became popular during our history of segregation. And there were people who were actually afraid of their white kids listening to the music of black artists. And we're going to learn more about how that controversy heightened at the end of the 50s when the payola scandal hit the scene. And that is quite a tale to tell. So in this episode, please know you're going to see some interviews and hear language that is quite offensive in some regards. Sometimes you will hear cussing in some of the documentaries that we air. But in this particular episode, you're going to be hearing people express their outrage of young teenagers listening to the music of black artists. and the N-word does appear in some of these interviews. But it gives us great historical context about how this music became popular amongst all the young people, and the parents just didn't understand. They didn't understand it, and sometimes they really didn't like it. All right, I hope you enjoy watching the next documentary episode, and I will see you in the next guide video. Rock on.